We're about to see a Black woman nominated for the Supreme Court. Unheard of in the 1960s. So we've made enormous progress in many ways. We don't have segregated restaurants. We don't have segregated buses. We see voter suppression. But in the 1960s, no African Americans could vote at all. So we've made enormous progress. We've also seen some steps backwards. The mass incarceration of young Black men is much worse than it was in the 1960s. So that's a way in which we've gone backwards. But the one area where we have not made progress is in neighborhood segregation, residential segregation. The civil rights movement in the 1960s really ended after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing, but did nothing to redress the existing segregation, which was so powerful that just preventing future discrimination doesn't do much to put a dent into it.
You're early. Nobody's ever early.
I'm always early. My wife is always late. On average, we're always on time.
Nice.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for being here, Richard, very much. So how did you even start to think about this idea of, cities being segregated and how they were set up?
Well, for probably 2 decades, I was an education policy writer. In the 1990s, late 1990s and early 2000s, I was the weekly education columnist at the New York Times. Mm-hmm. I came to the conclusion that the national education policy that we were following, which was broadly supported across the political spectrum, made no sense. Mm-hmm. The idea was that the reason that African American children achieved at lower levels than white children on average was because their teachers were lazy and had low expectations, was the term that was used. And that if only we could force teachers to try harder, the achievement gap would disappear.
Right.
I thought this was silly. Of course, there's some lazy teachers. Most teachers are dedicated and hardworking. The reason we have an achievement gap between Black and white children is because so many Black children come to a school with serious social and economic challenges that impedes their learning. Eliminating lazy teachers isn't going to overcome those challenges. So, for example, I remember writing a column in the Times about asthma. African American children in urban areas have asthma at as much as 4 times the rate of middle-class children. They have asthma at such a high rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods. They have more vermin in the environment, more industry nearby, more trucks driving by their apartment buildings. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't have asthma to be up at night wheezing and come to school drowsy the next day. And a child who's drowsy is not going to achieve as well as a child who is wide awake on average. And the asthma is not the biggest cause of the achievement gap, but you begin to think of all of the other similar challenges that children from disadvantaged, particularly African American neighborhoods have: asthma, lead poisoning, homelessness, economic insecurity. You explain the achievement gap. Well, it's one thing if a child has one of these challenges. It's another thing if you have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges. How can you ever expect a school like that to achieve at the same level as a school where children come healthy and well-rested and well-nourished from economically secure homes? You can't have that expectation. And we passed a law in 2001 saying if we only force teachers to try harder by publishing the test scores of their children, they'd be shamed and the achievement gap would disappear in 7 years. Well, we've still got the same achievement gap, essentially, that we had in 2001 because the theory was so silly. But we call schools where we concentrate children like that with these kinds of disadvantages. We call them segregated schools. And schools are segregated today. They're actually more segregated than they have been at any time in the last 45 years because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So as an education policy writer, I wasn't thinking about becoming an expert in this stuff. As an education policy writer, I decided that I better look into neighborhood segregation as an educational issue. That's how I got into this.
So, I'm familiar with the education gap, as you call it. I've heard that discussed many times before, but I haven't heard about neighborhoods being segregated as we've made some attempt. It's like you're going up a level into how these cities are set up and how these neighborhoods are set up and laid out. And, that ultimately is one of the real reasons that this problem doesn't go away. Yeah.
Well, as I say, neighborhood segregation is the reason the schools are segregated because schools are located in segregated neighborhoods. So If we want to understand educational problems, we've got to understand how those neighborhoods came to be segregated. And if we want to address those educational problems, we've got to do something about the conditions of the neighborhoods from which children come to school. So that was the connection.
So how did they get segregated? How did this start,
Well, that, as you know, is a long story. I can tell you how I came to this, and I was, I say, an education policy writer, not really thinking much except for this aspect of it. And then in 2007, as an education policy writer, I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated a program of both Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, to attempt to desegregate their schools to address the kinds of problems I was just talking about. They gave parents the choice of which school their child would attend. But if the choice of the parent was going to intensify segregation, it wouldn't be honored. So if you had an all-white, a mostly white school, both a black and a white child applied for it. The last remaining place, the black child was given some preference, helped to desegregate the school. And the Supreme Court evaluated this program. It was, as I say, in the Seattle, Washington, Louisville, Kentucky, were the two districts that were being considered. And the Supreme Court denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing, said it was unconstitutional to do such a thing, to try to desegregate the schools. And Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the controlling opinion. And the Chief Justice said that it's true. He said the schools in Seattle and Louisville are segregated. He said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they located is segregated. That's true and obvious. But he said the neighborhoods in which they're segregated were segregated without government involvement. That's why it's unconstitutional to try to fix this. Purely private. He said they were segregated because maybe bigoted white homeowners wouldn't sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or maybe private businesses like banks and realtors and developers were discriminatory in how they carried out their private sector activities, or maybe it's just because people like to live with each other of the same race, or maybe it's just a question of income differences. He called this de facto segregation. He said, we have de facto segregation the government wasn't responsible for. It's unconstitutional. Try to fix it. Well, I remembered reading about something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky some years before. There was a white homeowner in a single family home in the suburb of Louisville called Shively. That white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child. He wanted to move to a single family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this single family home bought a second home and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police made no effort to stop it. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I said to myself, this doesn't seem to me much like de facto segregation. The police, the prosecutors, the courts, the entire criminal justice system, these are agents of the state. This was a 14th Amendment violation. They used violence to try to preserve segregation. And I looked into it further, and I found there were hundreds and hundreds of cases. I'm not exaggerating when I use those words, hundreds and hundreds of cases across the country, not just in border states like Kentucky, but New York and Washington and Baltimore and Chicago and Detroit, Kansas City and Denver and Los Angeles and San Francisco. You go across the country of police protected, sometimes police organized and led violence to drive African Americans out of homes that they legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. This was a massive 14th Amendment violation. Never been remedied. We've never accepted an obligation to remedy it. And so then I began to look into it even further. And I realized that in the course of my research that it wasn't just state-sponsored violence that created the neighborhood segregation that we have today. But there were many policies of the federal, state, and local governments that were racially explicit, designed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country.
First of all, what year was that where that case you just described, the first one?
It was in the mid-1950s. I don't recall exactly, maybe 1954. I could look it up, but
okay.
Mid-1950s.
And you're saying that those policies, that protection, that structure is still intact today? Is that still?
Well, of course, it's not that the police drive African Americans out of white neighborhoods today, but the systems of segregation that we set up were so powerful that they're still in existence today. So For example, one of the things I write about in The Color of Law is the way in which the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration suburbanized the entire white working class population in the post-World War II period. We were not a suburban country at that time. The suburbs were largely created for working class families by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration. The particular suburb I described in The Color of Law, but these existed in every metropolitan area of the country, was Levittown, east of New York City. It's probably well known because it was the largest of them, 17,000 homes east of New York City. Enormous project. The builder, William Levitt, could never have assembled the capital to build that development on his own. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money for it. As I say, we weren't a suburban country at the time. The banks thought this was a crazy idea. He had no buyers for these homes he was building. I thought it was a speculative nonsense. The only way that Levitt could get the funds to buy the land and construct this development, and this is true, as I say, in projects all over the country, every metropolitan area, was to go to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, get a bank guarantee, a federal bank guarantee for his loans on condition that he would never sell a home to an African American. This was an explicit condition of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations. They even required Levitt, and this again is true of developments all over this country, to place a clause in the deed of every home that prohibited resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These working class homes, as I say, these were people living in urban areas. We were a manufacturing economy at that time. Plants, factories had to be located near deep water ports, railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. And the workers at those factories, as well as at the banks that serviced them and other service industries, had to live in broadly the same downtown areas in order to be able to walk to work or maybe take short streetcar rides. They were inexpensive homes. The homes in Levittown, and again, even in California, which today has inconceivable housing prices, they sold at the time for about $100,000 in today's inflation-adjusted money. That was about twice national median income. Any family with a household head who was employed in the post-war boom can afford to buy a home for $100,000. That's twice national median income, especially for returning war veterans. No down payment required. African Americans were as able to buy those homes as whites. The whites, though, were permitted to buy those homes. The African Americans were prohibited from doing so. Those $100,000 homes, though, over the next couple of generations gained in value. You can no longer buy a home in Levittown for $100,000. They cost $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 today. 6-7 times national median income. In California, those $100,000 homes now go for over $1 million. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the equity they accidentally got from those homes. They didn't expect to do this. They didn't move to these suburbs because they thought they were going to get rich. They wanted a place to live in the post-war housing shortage. But the houses appreciated in these white neighborhoods. African Americans prohibited from moving to them. The result is that today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes, family incomes. It's about 60%. You would think that if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. But in fact, while there's African American family incomes are 60% of white family incomes, African American household wealth is about 5% of white household wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that's never been remedied. Well, we passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. It said in effect, to African Americans, okay, you can now move to Levittown. But Levittown's now unaffordable to even middle-class families of either race, unless they have down payments from their parents or grandparents. The white families who moved into these suburbs and saw this accidental accumulation of wealth used it to send their children to college. They used it to take care of perhaps temporary unemployment or a medical emergency. They used it to subsidize their retirement, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. So the policies were so powerful that they determine the racial landscape of today. The Fair Housing Act is incapable of remedying it. Of course, it makes a trivial difference. Levittown is now about 1% to 2% African American because under the Fair Housing Act, if you have $500,000 or inherited wealth, you can buy a house in Levittown. But Levittown's located in a neighborhood that's about 15% African American. So that difference between the 2% that the Fair Housing Act was able to address, and the 15% that you would expect Levittown to be if it were not for this unconstitutional federal policy, is the unremedied consequence of these unconstitutional policies that the federal government was following.
Now, have there been successful examples of a just neighborhood,
As I just said, yes, there are some African Americans who are able to move into white neighborhoods, predominantly white neighborhoods. It's not like the segregation today is 100% the way it was when it was created by the federal government. But overall, African Americans are disproportionately concentrated in low opportunity areas, and whites are disproportionately concentrated in high opportunity areas because we've never remedied the racially explicit policies that we enacted in the 20th century.
So, it's just this thing, this web that's grown and strong. And so from deconstructing it or disentangling it, where do you even begin? Because you're talking now about at the highest levels. So if we, wanting to work against this system, this structure, how would you think about untangling it? Where does the work come?
Well, untangling it is actually easy. We know what to do. There's no lack of information about what to do. Policy experts know what to do. What's missing is a civil rights movement in this country, like the one in the 1960s, that's going to make it uncomfortable not to implement these well-known policies. We don't have the political support to fix this now. There are a lot of people who put Black Lives Matter signs on their lawns, but there's no engagement in active organization to fix it. So I can give you, the examples would seem extreme to you of what we should do. For example, as I say, in the 1940s and 50s, these suburbs were created on a racially explicit basis. You can't fix that without racially explicit remedial policies. The federal government should be buying up homes in Levittown as they come for sale at market rates, reselling them at deep discounts to African-American families. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. There's no political support for that in this country today. We need a new civil rights movement. But if there were a new civil rights movement that was making it uncomfortable not to redress these problems, we could make some progress. We're making a lot of small progress around the country. It's not like we're not doing anything, but the kind of massive attention to this problem that's necessary to fix it, it does not exist.
But, a modern day civil rights movement, what is a little bit more about how you think that would look, and uncomfortable in ways that we can understand, a contemporary audience can understand. And also really you're focusing on African American Black population and in civil rights of the 60s, there's also, you need everyone, right? We're not free to all free. So how do you think about a contemporary civil rights movement in a way that none of us are thinking?
Well, as I mentioned a minute ago, in 2020, we had 20 million Americans who demonstrated for Black Lives Matter. Most of them were white. The demonstrations were most frequently led by African Americans, but most of the participants were white. This is unheard of in American history. We're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race in this country than we ever have had before in American history, about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. People are becoming aware of things they were never before aware of. But it's a passive understanding. I can't tell you how a new civil rights movement is going to begin, but at some point, I'm hopeful, I'm not confident, but I'm hopeful that people with this understanding will come together to decide to do something about it. And there are many, many, many things that can be done at a local level. That's where a civil rights movement has to start, at a local level. We're never going to, you don't start with national policy. You start at a local level, and there are many things that can be done at a local level to redress segregation. I can give you many, many examples. I'll just give you one because I know we're running out of time now. Once you have two populations that are in very different circumstances, as African Americans and whites are in this country, race-neutral policies can reinforce their inequality even without being racially explicit. So, for example, we know, and this has been well documented, that African American homeowners in Black neighborhoods pay property taxes at a much higher rate than whites do, even though on paper the rates are the same. The reason that African Americans are paying higher property taxes is because properties in white neighborhoods have been appreciating in value faster than properties in Black neighborhoods. That means that if you don't do an annual reassessment, and many, many cities don't do it, they do it every few years, but they don't do an annual reassessment. It means that the value of properties in white neighborhoods is going to become more detached from their assessed value. I'm talking about the property assessors, the tax assessors who go out from counties and cities. The assessed value in white neighborhoods is going to be farther below their actual market value than the assessed values in Black neighborhoods. That means that Blacks are paying a higher property tax relative to the actual value of their homes than whites are paying. And this is widely recognized, by the way. It's no secret. County assessors acknowledge this problem. They just don't know what to do about it. An activist movement should be engaged in activity to press their counties and cities to give compensation to African Americans who've been overtaxed. That would be one way to begin to start to address this.
Have you seen this problem addressed in other countries in a more effective way?
No, I don't think that other countries are comparable in any way to this country. The legacy of slavery in particular and Jim Crow is unique to the United States. The other industrialized countries now have larger populations of dark-skinned minorities than they have had before. But these are relatively recent immigrants. These aren't the descendants of people who were enslaved. And they're not segregated by the kind of explicit racial policies that we had in this country that require, and they don't have the kinds of constitutions that require remediation that we have. So I don't think you can draw analogies from other places.
What about, it's a knowledge problem as well, like it's an education problem. I mean, how people not really understanding for what you just said, for example, this information should be everywhere. The things that we waste time on social media or, the kind of the news cycles, etc. So how do you think about that? I mean, obviously you've spent your life writing about this and this is your life's work, but in a contemporary now, what do we do? Because I think if more people had an understanding of that across the spectrum of our entire society, there would be hopefully more outrage. And, so how do you think about that?
Well, there is more understanding of it than there ever has been before in American history. I don't think the major problem we face now is a lack of understanding. The major problem we face is the movement from understanding to action. And that requires organizers, community organizers, civil rights activists who are committed to not just understanding it, but to doing something about it. We just, not just a year or more ago, celebrated the life of John Lewis, congressman who led the voting rights effort in Alabama in the 1960s. And he said that civil rights activists have to make good trouble to try to correct this. And it's going to require something like that. I'm too old to know what the tactics of the new civil rights movement will be. They won't be identical to the ones of the 1960s that I was familiar with. But, I've heard of this social media thing you talk about. I guess that could play a role. But maybe marches and demonstrations will also play a role.
And voting, I mean, local voting, right? So what one can do, you said it's a local problem specifically,
Right. Well, obviously voting is essential, but first there has to be an education campaign and calling attention to the problems so that it become an issue in elections.
Yeah, it's taken quite a long time for us to get into this problem. How long do you think it's going to take to get out? I mean, it's not like if we start tomorrow, we'll be out of this sometime soon. Do you see progress from, the 60s to now? Are we in a different era?
Well, we've made enormous progress from the 60s to now. In some ways, we've gone backwards. We have for example, a very, very significant Black middle class today that's integrated into the professional workforces of this country. We're about to see a Black woman nominated for the Supreme Court, unheard of in the 1960s. So we've made enormous progress in many ways. We don't have segregated restaurants. We don't have segregated buses. We see voter suppression, but in the 1960s, no African Americans could vote at all, to all intents and purposes, in many parts of the country. So we've made enormous progress. We've also seen some steps backwards. The mass incarceration of young Black men is much worse than it was in the 1960s. So that's a way in which we've gone backwards. But the one area where we have not made progress is in neighborhood segregation, residential segregation. The civil rights movement in the 1960s really ended after the passage of the Fair Housing Act which prohibited in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing, but did nothing to redress the existing segregation, which was so powerful that just preventing future discrimination doesn't do much to put a dent into it.
You know, if I'm a person and I'm just looking for a house in a neighborhood, I'm not aware of all these things that you're talking about, right? You know, does this have to be solved at the city level, or can it be solved at the level of, like, you know, it strikes me as it's sort of a different problem, because it's not just saying, hey, let's integrate the bus, right? It's a problem where you're saying, well, this whole neighborhood has to be fixed. So how do you affect that kind of problem? Is that a city hall kind of thing?
Well, it has to be addressed at every level, but it's not going to be addressed at any level unless there's the mobilization of civil rights activists who want to make it an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Real estate agents today, there's continued discrimination in the real estate industry.
Yeah.
That's a level that has to be addressed at. Real estate agents, many of them, not all, but too many, continue to steer white home seekers to white neighborhoods and black home seekers to black neighborhoods. This is an ongoing problem. Clearly, there can be much more enforcement of that. There are fair housing centers in most parts of this country. Most big cities have fair housing centers. They can test realtors to see if this kind of discrimination is going on. And it goes on not just for house purchases, but for rentals as well. And they test them by sending matched pairs of testers to pretend to be seeking a home and demonstrate that the black home seeker is treated differently from the white home seeker when they go to the same real estate agency. Well, those fair housing centers are underfunded. They can do very little of this testing. And so most of this discrimination at the real estate level is unremedied. That's a very low-level thing that can be done, is simply funding more testing. And as I say, it's not just home seekers, it's buyers, it's rentals. They can test the rentals. They have a black apartment seeker call up a landlord and they give a name that sounds like they're black, and a white apartment seeker calls up the same landlord with a clearly white name. And the first one is told the apartment isn't available, and the second one is told that it is. And this goes on all over the country. But testing is expensive. And unless these fair housing centers are better funded, we're not going to be able to root out this problem. And that's a very low-level thing to deal with.
Are you optimistic for the future?
I'm hopeful for the future. I think there's enormous potential. I don't know if my hopes will be realized, but I think they can be.
Thank you so much for talking to us about this. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your interest.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. There's a lot to think about
Yeah.
what needs to be done. A couple of ideas just came to mind. So thank you so much.
Okay.